Right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second wave and tidal energy session of this conference. I'm Stephanie Merry. I'm the Marine Energy Sector Advisor to the Renewable Energy Association in London. I'm also an independent technical consultant, and it's my pleasure to be the chair for this session. I have been told to read out an emergency brief for you, but I think we can get away with saying that in an emergency there will be an announcement over the PA saying that the situation has arisen. Please leave the building as fast as you can, as directed by SECC staff. And please may I ask you all to put your phones on silent or turn them off. I've done that with mine. That's good. Right, this is an interesting session. It's called Wave and Tidal 2, The Essentials, and we are going to get presentations on leasing, consenting, finance, legal, and environmental aspects of marine renewable energy. And I think what ties all those together is that they all raise, tempted to say barriers, but they are things that need to be overcome by a developer who wants to deploy a project or a device in the marine environment. So without further ado, let's go to our keynote speaker, who is Ronnie Quinn, General Manager for the Scotland portfolio of the Crown Estate. Ronnie's just explained to me that doesn't just mean the marine portfolio, he's also in charge of all the land stuff and the farming, so a very diverse person, shall we say. So he is General Manager of the Crown Estate Scotland portfolio and leads the business in Scotland under the authority of the Scottish Management Board. And he's also head of the UK Ocean Energy portfolio, comprising all the wave and tidal developments in UK waters, so as far down south and southwest as Falmouth, I guess. And before joining the Crown Estate, he was a consultant advising on electricity market restructurings, price controls, transmission policies. And previously, he was Managing Director of Scottish Electricity Settlements Limited. So, Ronnie, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along. I rather mischievously put the title of this afternoon's session for my bit anyway, as Through Pathways Rough and Muddy. And for any of you who have travelled here by car, either from the north, the east, or the south, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. The major infrastructure works that are going on round about Glasgow almost have a stranglehold in the city. The traffic cone salesman must have done a roaring trade over the last couple of years. Anyway, hopefully a bit more of that later on. Once I get the technology to work. So, what I'm going to try and cover very briefly this afternoon are why I believe it's a steadily improving context, a little bit about the Crown Estate, a bit about what we're doing with current leasing opportunities and how ocean energy is still a real focus for the Crown Estate, particularly in Scotland. So, for those of you who don't know, the Crown Estate is a separate organisation. It's an arm's length organisation from government. It's independent. Over the piece, as a UK organisation, last financial year, or for the financial year 2014-15, the surplus, which most people call profit, was 285 million. The capital value was about 11.5 billion. The Scotland portfolio, the piece north of the border, was somewhat less than that. The surplus would be about 14 million and the capital value about 260 odd million. What do we do? The role, and it's a commercial role, is to ensure that the land and the property we invest in and manage are sustainably worked, developed and enjoyed to deliver the best value over the long term. And as said, there's a strong commercial element to that because we have a mandate to increase the value of the portfolio, but also to transfer that surplus that I spoke about to, at this point in time, to Treasury. And so to that extent, we're 100% taxed. There's no tax avoidance measures. Everything that we make goes to Treasury. So far as ocean energy is concerned, we try to split that responsibility, and we do view it as a responsibility, but also an opportunity into three areas. One is the more traditional aspect of the Crown Estate, which is providing leasing. Another is facilitating, and the third traditionally has been investment, both in studies and in making things happen, but more recently in direct investment in projects. The Maygen project being a case in point, where we co-invested with the other partners, and we've put in 10 million into that project. So, just in case anyone doesn't know what the British Isles look like, these are the waters that the Crown Estate manages. Within 12 nautical miles, it's the traditional Crown Estate boundary, and that forms part of the Crown Estate. Out to 200 nautical miles, that forms part of the renewable energy zone, and under one of the Energy Acts, the Crown Estate has responsibility again for turning that area into a profitable area for renewable energy. So, fairly sizable chunk, 850,000 square kilometres of seabed. However, as we all know, not all of that is developable at this point in time for offshore wind, floating or fixed, and certainly not all of it's developable at this point in time for either tidal technologies or wave technologies. I mentioned previously things are changing going forward. We have had a piece of legislation that anyone reading the news recently would have been aware of, and it's now the Scotland Act, which is embodying some of the provisions of the Smith Commission from 2014. One of those provisions is that the Crown Estate managed assets in Scotland will transfer to Scottish ministers. And that will happen now under the Scotland Act, and that will happen, we believe, sometime next year, during 2017. To facilitate that, and the Crown Estate's been very clear from the beginning that this isn't being seen as a hostile takeover, we are really quite energised by this move, and what's happened has been that we have, so far as we are able, set up a separate accounting business unit within Scotland. And that is now being run separately from the Crown Estate for England and Wales, and everything, as Stephanie said, that formerly formed part of the Crown Estate, so the landed estates, the coastal, the aquaculture, that all now forms part of one entity being managed out of Edinburgh alongside the energy portfolio encompassing wave, tidal, offshore wind. Total value, as I said, just over 260 million. We are really ambitious, particularly for the energy sector. We live and work in Scotland. We are keen to make this work. We want to be part of building something, not demolishing something. And that fits, I think, very well with the ocean energy sector, in particular the wave and the tidal sectors. We like to think that we've got significant expertise across these sectors, and we're looking to try and capitalise on that going forward. So, why would I say it's a steadily improving context? It's almost trendy now to say that the wave and tidal sector is dying, or it's on its last legs, or it's in need of resuscitation. And I'm bring to mind in the office last week we had defibrillator training, and for anyone who hasn't had that yet, get your office to get a defibrillator. It's a really good thing, particularly for middle-aged, overweight guys like myself. It's a really good thing to know that others in the organisation know how to restart you when you stop. But I don't see the wave and tidal sector being anywhere near in need of that yet. Why? Because there's still an awful lot going on. And this is just a snapshot of some of the 50 or so projects, 40 that are currently live around the UK. There's a lot still happening. Yes, there are challenges, and CFD in particular is causing some concern, but we're not at the end point with that yet, and things will change, will move forward. And that's exemplified by these projects that are up here. Things are still working, things are still happening, money is still being spent, and developments are still underway. And we're keen to facilitate that as best we can. So it's not on its last legs. What it has done has re-evaluated where it is. 5 years ago, had I been standing up here, we'd be talking about 200 megawatt sites and 1,600 megawatts out of the Pentland Firth by 2016. We all know that that's not where we are. Where we are now is a much more realistic, if I use that term, point in the industry. We are now looking at much smaller scale developments that are investable and are deliverable, and for that reason, that's where, they're the sustainable investments that we can work on over the next few years. So, where are we with regard to Crown Estate leasing? We took a bit of time to sit back and see where the market was. We quickly identified that we're no longer at the stage where the market were looking for 1, 2, 300 megawatt sites. Much, much smaller scale. We spoke to the market. We did identify there was a current demand for smaller sites of up to 3 megawatts and for more flexibility. What we did was brought in September last year a new process for leasing of up to 3 megawatts. And what's different about it? The old one was, I will use the term, bureaucratic. The new one, hopefully, is still nodding towards due process, but it should be much, much simpler for people to implement. Instead of the old expressions of interest, PQQ and ITT, we've now just got 2 parts. We no longer have fixed windows, which was engendering seabed grabs, if I can put it that way, where people weren't sure when the next window would be opening, so they would just grab a bit of seabed while they could. What we're doing now is saying, come and speak to us when you're ready. And what's that engendered? That's engendered people thinking about when they actually need to come to us. We've scaled back significantly our oversight and project management requirements, and by doing that, we're hopefully making that a bit more flexible. We're not stepping away from our responsibilities entirely, however. We're still going to require a real demonstration of the commitment to the project, its financial commitment, the programme, business plan, how health and safety is going to be managed, and some detail around the technology. Why sites have been selected, route to consenting, what the grid strategy is, and the like. Come to us with that, and the details are on the website, and we'll be happy to take things forward with you. Our focus in the Crown Estate has stayed the same. We're still keen to support the growth of the emerging industry. We're having to step back a bit from scale, but we're still keen to make this work. We are keen to encourage development and ultimately to attract investment into the sector, particularly large-scale investment, because this is not anyone's idea, as people here should be aware this is nobody's idea of a get-rich-quick scheme. We need significant investment, particularly at this point in time. Where does the Crown Estate fit in? Largely in seabed access, the traditional role. As I said, we are still keen to facilitate, work with developers, commission studies, and we've been doing so. But we appreciate that we're only one piece of this particular cake. You still need to get grid access, and there are still issues about that, particularly on the west coast of Scotland. Regulatory consent, and I know there's going to be more said about that quite shortly. Technology. However many developers come to me and say, my technology works, it still needs to be proven, because that's the only way you'll get the last piece, which is the funding.
2 minutes, please, Ronnie.
So, how do we balance this? And it is a balancing act. And I know that there's going to be more said about risk later on, but it is a balancing act between risk and return and readiness for investment. And what we need to do is de-risk this to a stage where everyone has an acceptable level of risk, an acceptable level of return, and the readiness for investment is there. I said at the outset that I'd say a bit more about pathways rough and muddy. It's a line from Robert Burns' epigram. I'm now arrived, thanks to the gods, through pathways rough and muddy. A certain sign that making roads is no this people's study. Although I'm no with scripture crammed, I'm sure the Bible says that heedless sinners shall be damned unless they mend their ways. We need to mend our ways. We need to make this simple. We need to smooth out some of these roads. We need to get this infrastructure working. It's not dead yet, but we've got more to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Yes, personally, I've always found the Crown Estate have been very supportive of marine energy, and I'm pleased to know that they are still on that road. Now, our next speaker, it says here that he's got 8 years of experience in tidal power, but I said, Joe, I'm sure I met you longer ago than that, Joe. Joe Hulm is director of his own company, Ocean Energy Advisors. And when I first met him, he was working for International Power, which has now been acquired by Energy, where he was actually starting to set up the Maygen project. So that's quite a long time ago now, Joe, isn't it? And currently he is doing, as a mature student, obviously, a master's degree in energy, environmental technology and economics at City University. And so he is going to talk about risk and the effect that has on project financing. Thank you, Joe.
Steph, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. The insurance debt nexus, the relationship between insurance and finance, begs the question, can risk policy make tidal power bankable? Can risk policy make tidal power bankable? That's the subject title of my thesis of a Master's in Energy, Environmental Technology and Economics at City University London. I'm fortunate to be sponsored by my own company, Ocean Energy Advisors, and as Steph kindly mentions, I draw on over 8 years full-time in tidal power, and much longer than that as well before that. I did have a great deal of involvement in the Maygen project in 2010. I led investment on behalf of International Power alongside Morgan Stanley, and more recently, as OEA's first client, I was involved in project development for Blue Water Energy Services on both sides of the Atlantic. So the question I put to you, can risk policy make tidal power bankable, is about addressing a funding gap, about attracting project finance, debt, into tidal power projects. In order to do so, we need to think outside of the equity box, which is, I think, where people were focused about 5 years ago, and it was often utility equity. We need to make projects bankable, and therefore to attract investment from non-utility sources. And as I think we've heard mentioned a few times on panels such as this, there's been an ongoing discussion over the past 18 months between the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers of the turbines, be they fixed or floating, and the project developers. The OEMs have been saying to the project developers, in order for us to invest more in our technology, we need to see a pipeline of projects. And for those pipelines to exist, they need to be financed. In turn, the project developers have turned back to the OEMs over the past 18 months on panel sessions like this and said, show us the warranty then. So there's this catch-22, and there's a gap. There's a gap between the OEMs and the project developers. So this period of academic research, which is based on a number of years trying to solve these problems in the commercial world, does beg the question, can risk policy make tidal power bankable? Before embarking on this, it's important to understand and learn lessons from the past. The period of deregulation at the end of the Clinton administration did lead to some financial innovation, such as transactional insurance products, that, as we all know, as quoted in the past in 2002 by Warren Buffett, could lead to WMD, financial weapons of mass destruction. That's a real quote. However, it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The relationship between insurance and M&A, raising debt for projects, project finance, under appropriate regulation for productive lending in real projects could still have some value to this sector. There is a need for risk policy for productive lending. And this is the focus of my next few months' worth of research. And I call it the insurance debt nexus. And it's about bridging the gap between policy and equity. Over the past 5 years or more, a lot of the government funding, subsidy, policy has been focused on the equity side of a project. This obviously comes with it a certain amount of political baggage in terms of grant funding being very visible to the media, subject to EU state aids, and of course having to contend with the austerity agenda. And part of the research, which will take into account the views and viewpoints of a number of actors in the sector, investigate the opportunity for insurance and debt to work together to bridge this gap. And these are just example organisations that could be involved in this area of research, whereby policy that backs insurance products, insuring against the loss of business, could enable banks to provide debt, project finance, into tidal power projects. If you look at the top of the screen, you'll see that through policy, you can underwrite and subsidise the entry of insurers into the market, which in turn attracts lenders into the space. And I will argue in my research, and I will take into account views of organisations such as these, that this is a more effective way of attracting equity into tidal power projects by having policy-backed insurance products that lever debt into the project. Now, that's quite a lot to take in, and I'm very mindful of the need for clear communication and of language to be appropriate for the relevant audience. And there are three words that come to mind, and it's physics, engineering, and finance. Those are the three disciplines, physics, engineering, finance, that are necessary to be fully understood as part of the picture to communicate this approach. So the predictable intermittency inherent in the physics of the fuel type of tidal is, I think, well known to most people in this room. It can lead to, in engineering terms, variable baseload, which for the financial community is perhaps better understood as a variable annuity, whereby any loss of revenue is offset by business interruption insurance. This is where insurers who are shy at the moment of this space could benefit from government policy, government subsidy to enter the space, place business interruption insurance, provide a variable annuity type profile that therefore attracts both the lenders and the investors that the industry needs. And I argue that this is a more effective use of public subsidy than going straight into the project on the grant and equity level. Now, it's always heartening to know that one's thoughts are not in isolation. If you look at section 4.4 of the Ocean Energy Forum draft roadmap, this was published in September last year, it points to the argument to create an EU insurance fund to underwrite demonstration project risks. Now, this is a collaborative document, and the particular work group is chaired by the Crown Estate and Ocean Energy Europe, and will report in full to the European Commission later on this year. Now, I should emphasise that this particular piece of research is entirely separate from my own thesis. However, it's heartening to know that my thoughts are not in isolation, and that there could be some common overlap between both the audience and the messages for these two documents, for both this roadmap in its final form and in my own thesis when it's published this summer. One way in which the approach that I'm taking with OEA at City University London does differ from the EU approach is to focus on one particular project. And very lucky to be working closely, early stage, but in good discussions with Perpetuous Tidal Energy Centre, who, as you may know, have recently been awarded offshore planning consent by the MMO. This is a 30 megawatt multi-turbine commercial project, and we'll use it as a likely case study for the thesis. This is very useful for both us and I hope for PTEC as well, in that it will enable the concepts, the thoughts, the ideas to be crystallized through the channel of one particular project, and therefore communicated as clearly as possible to the audience with a case study in mind. And of course, the outcomes of this research, as well as being of potential use to PTEC, could be of value to the wider industry across the UK, EU, and further afield. So, as I draw to a close, I'd like to remind myself, as well as others, that there are three reasons why Tidal is a focal point here. One is my own expertise and experience in the sector. Stick to what you know. And the second point, as I've mentioned a few times, is the physics of the fuel type. The potential for a variable annuity from physics to engineering to finance to be communicated. The very predictability of the nature of the fuel type. And finally, often overlooked, is that the very nascent nature of this sector compared to, say, solar or wind means that it can be contractually flexible in this young market. And commercial, contractual innovation can be just as valuable as technical innovation. And there is potential, once proven in Tidal, for this type of approach, this approach of a variable annuity to be rolled out to other projects, both on and offshore. We'll see. And one thing that I like to remind myself is that I've mentioned physics a few times, and this quote from Albert Einstein: "If we knew what it was we were doing, it would not be called research, would it?" And to wrap up, so at City University London, on behalf of my own firm, Ocean Energy Advisors, I remind myself of three important questions. Where is the problem in terms of the academic research? What is the problem you're trying to solve? Try to find the answer, and ultimately, especially in case of the partners that you're working with and the audience that you aim to approach, who can deliver? That's me on the insurance debt nexus. Can risk policy make tidal power bankable? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. Yes, I think the issue of risk in marine renewables is actually quite high and is something we do need to address. Right, our next speaker is Glen Plant. That's right, isn't it? I missed anybody out. No. Glen used to be a practicing barrister, but he has now stopped and he's become an independent consultant in policy with, he says, a high legal content, which is quite useful because he's got degrees in law and diplomacy from Oxford, Harvard, London, and the Hague Academy of International Law. And he's taught at the LSE and a couple of other universities as well. He's worked in the UN and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for several years as a lawyer. He specialises in environment, energy and climate change and marine matters. So he's told me he's going to change the title of his speech, so I can't actually tell you what he's going to be talking about.
Sorry.
So, Glen, if you'd like to come and tell us, please.
I'm afraid I can't promise you lots of wonderful pictures. I was a bit crook in the last few days, so I'm afraid it's only words. I'll press on because I'm threatened if I go on for too long.
Yes.
Persuading stick law. When I look into a case, I always look for one of two areas of strong law. EU law, because governments can suffer daily fines. Criminal law, for obvious reasons. I've decided to talk about two problems today because problems involving both have recently arisen in relation to tidal stream and wave. First of all, there is a putative EIA problem. Our esteemed panel chairman has been quoted by the House of Commons Environmental Audit Committee along the lines of there being a danger that EU EIA procedures will kill off this embryonic industry. The press's take on it, they've picked up a couple of the examples that she gave. A 30 megawatt project, which I assume is the Perpetuous project off the Isle of Wight, I should probably have checked that with you, at the cost of more than £1 million, and the MCT turbine project in Stanford Lock, which had to fork out £2 million for environmental monitoring on top of a £10 million budget. It seems to be a big problem. The other area I will look at more briefly is decommissioning. The time taken to negotiate decommissioning plans should not be measured in years. I think sometimes it is. I think sometimes there's a need for pushback against what DEC and agencies are trying to impose. The estimate of decommissioning costs is based on complete removal. I keep asking myself why, because the international law rules are contained in Article 6, paragraph 3 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they are effectively that you should remove to ensure safety of navigation while taking into account environmental considerations. There's no obligation to remove completely. And if you think about many small tidal stream projects, they're often in waters that are unnavigable, at least by fleets, perhaps the odd fishing boat or two, but that could be dealt with separately. So I know there are guidelines, but I am constantly questioning the basis of those guidelines. A rather minor matter is the charging of VAT in decommissioning security amounts. VAT is a tax on consumption. The rates of VAT are in process of being repatriated to the UK, and I don't see it as a reason to charge VAT now for something that may take place in 15 years' time, because DEC cannot be sure of recovering VAT from the Treasury, which is the only reason I've been given for this. The most important thing, I think, is there's a temptation to deploy for operational, by which I mean operational financial reasons, without consents, including full DEC consent to a decommissioning plan and compliance with the conditions of that plan in place. Never do this. It has been done. There are situations where there's a feeling, look, we really have to do this now and take the legal consequences. My take on that is make sure you are never put in that position in the first place. It is possible to push back, not merely in negotiating political terms against government departments and government lawyers that are telling you what to do. I'm going to try and illustrate that in the course of the talk. The reason I feel strongly about this is the oil and gas decommissioning precedents are IT-based, and if you pay too much for your decommissioning program, and or you get yourself in a position where you're being threatened with prosecution, you're establishing a very unfortunate precedent for the rest of the industry. Okay, I'm talking primarily about small arrays and single demonstration devices. I'm not going to talk about tidal range or tidal lagoon. That's for two reasons. One, something like the Swansea Bay tidal lagoon is really terrestrial. It has much stronger land-based or linked elements, and supply chain complications. Essentially, it was going to get the very, very hard rock from Cornwall. A quarry called Dean Quarry was to be revived. Planning applications made, a year and a half wasted, because at the end there was a judicial review of the planning decision. I don't need to bother you with the reason for that. That's the name of the case if you're curious. But nothing to do with Tidal Lagoon Swansea, except that they wanted to build a breakwater and a port there to take away the stuff. But they wasted a lot of time because of litigation that was nothing to do with them, but only to do with their supply chain. I don't allow a workman to do anything in my house unless I have a pretty good idea of what it is he's supposed to be doing and how much it's supposed to cost. I sometimes worry about the way industry uses lawyers. And I think there are two publications that everybody here involved in the industry should read before they talk to their lawyers. It's self-promoting, but the first one is an article, a two-part article I wrote in 2013, which was effectively my gift to the marine energy industry. It deals with the public law aspects of the industry. The other one is analogous. It's about wind, but one can learn a lot. It deals with the private law aspects. It's written by a CMS Cameron McKenna lawyer. It's very good. No need to read these lists, but just to illustrate, there are many areas of law involved in marine energy. This is not a complete list, but an important division is between public law areas. I'm a public lawyer. I don't pretend to know very much about the private law, and the private lawyers should not pretend to know too much about the public law. If you want to cover energy law, you really need to cover it from the level of the UN all the way down to the parish council. If you take into account the number of areas of law involved, the division between public and private, the levels at which you have to cover it, no one man or no one law firm can do all of this. So I suggest that you use public as well as private lawyers, public international, EU, national, and you bring in specialists as necessary. There's a tendency to say, oh, I've got my lawyers, I'm happy with them, I can't deal with anybody else. Actually, solicitors and barristers are generalists and specialists. Barristers are brought in to give specialist advice. It happens all the time. So you should be very careful about using all the legal expertise you possibly can after reading those books, and integrate them from the very beginning in your policy. Don't treat them as firefighters or technicians. They're not. They're policy people. Okay, this is very important. I suggest that you look for the best lawyers, the top 10%. And there's harking back to the first few slides, the important thing to remember about a government lawyer is his mindset is he must not be seen to make a mistake, especially outside his own department. Therefore, this must always take priority over saving resources or imposing costs on industry. Okay? He has a judge over his shoulder. Remember always, what does he think a judge will say if he does X? So your private lawyers should be pushing back against this tendency. A common factor behind both the EIA and the decommissioning problem is that offshore oil and gas and offshore wind are precedents. Yes, they are in certain ways, but in other ways the precedents are unfortunate. And the way we go about negotiating treaties and drafting laws is always to take a model based on precedents. Offshore oil and gas does not equal offshore wind, does not equal tidal stream or wave. And I think in the decommissioning area, we're suffering from a degree of paranoia associated with the offshore oil and gas precedent. In 1979, the UK government did its sums and came up with a figure of the decommissioning cost for the North Sea at that time of 5 billion. It was an underestimate by a factor of about 2 to 3, but 2 to 3 times. But it alarmed them so much that they got the Article 60, Paragraph 3 amendment to the UN Law of the Sea Convention at a time when it was nigh on impossible to do it. Everything was done and dusted. We had to pull out all the stops, get the Americans, the French, and others to support us. That's how important that they felt it was. And the difference was, instead of having to remove completely, you only had to remove to the extent consistent with navigation. Okay, I no need to go on to in much detail about the Brent Spar. The very effective Greenpeace campaign around the Brent Spar incident caused a reversal back to a complete removal standard. The important thing to emphasize is that does not apply to ORE. There is no real guidance coming out of OSPAR on offshore wind, let alone marine energy. Okay, the REA's actual evidence, the House of Commons Environment Audit Committee, was a bit more sophisticated than the headline suggested. The MCT Strandford Lock £2 million overspend did involve a great deal that was just plain silly. TEL's Delta Stream project in Ramsey Sound was cited as having similar issues, and the Perpetuous Tidal Energy Centre, 21 volumes, £1 million EIA for a relatively small 30 megawatt site. I depart company with Steph a little bit here because it was a Rochdale envelope application with a great number of parameters having to be covered, because it's after all a demonstration site, part of the purpose of which is to save individual projects from going through the same EIA and consenting processes. So, to my mind, it wasn't that expensive. Okay, the REA suggested various improvements to the environmental directives, in particular the EIA directive. First of all, proportionality to the size of the project. Secondly, reflecting the positive impacts of marine energy projects. After all, we're there to help energy security and climate change. Reduced duplications of EIA and monitoring effort. It really is time that the government and the agencies started using the results of monitoring at one site and applying it to monitoring at another site to reduce the burden. And this is a little bit pie in the sky, I think, giving socioeconomic and conservation factors equal weight under the Habitats Directive. I don't think that's ever going to happen.
2 minutes, please, Glen.
Okay, yep. Okay, so I think the more important thing that the REA said to this committee was this one. Sorry, I forgot. Okay, regulators often appear over-precautionary in their implementation of environmental policies. We conclude that this is in response to concerns about possible litigation at EU level. This is my point about the mindset, which is never to put their heads above the parapet. Now, my view is that the EIA directive, properly interpreted, doesn't lead to the problems for projects described above. Although you have to bear in mind that some sites are so sensitive that even a small amount of disturbance requires an EIA. There is always member state discretion on interpretation of the directive as long as you stay within the objectives of the directive, which are set out in Article 2, Paragraph 1. It was also reformed in 2014, and I know this might sound unrealistic, but if you can possibly hold on your scoping and screening until the 16th of May 2012, you will be in a much better position. And because those reforms are being made, and they are very largely clarificatory of the existing text, you can meanwhile argue that under the 2011 version of the EIA directive, you ought to have a more liberal interpretation. So, tricks to proper interpretation. Always go to the directive. Don't mess around with the implementing directives. Always argue from the directive. That's what judges do. We're talking about people who are frightened of the judge over their shoulder. And while you're at it, make as much as you can out of the differences between the different language versions. There's usually a lot in there. Okay, sorry, I forgot to do that. Right, my authority for that is Lord Neuberger, a brilliant man, President of the Supreme Court. Can't get better. Okay, so relevant improvements to the EIA directive. First of all, there's now going to be a one-stop shop procedure where you do your EIA and your habitats, wild birds assessments in one go. There's a possibility of it being extended to other EU legislation like the Marine Framework Directive, the Water Framework Directive, etc. The project exemptions in exceptional cases are clarified where the application of those provisions would result in adversely affecting the purpose of the project, provided the objectives of this directive are met. So it's being tied in much more closely to what is this directive all about. It certainly isn't about causing excess burdens for fledgling industries. It's to make sure that the environment is protected while development consents are being given. There's a new mandatory monitoring requirement, but fear not, because it says it shall be proportionate to the nature, location, and size of the project and the significance of its effects on the environment. So a lot of the REA's concerns are actually being catered for. Okay, so no Brexit, please. Right. Finally, decommissioning. I'm not going to say much more about it, but there's an imminent EIR, Environmental Information Regulation request to discover from public sources the extent of the risk the industry is facing. Okay, any inputs to that would be most welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Glen. This is the first time I've actually sat and listened to a lawyer interpreting my words. When he says REA, it was me that wrote them, so and I'm very, very pleased to hear what he said about these changes to the EIA legislation, or directive, should I say. Right, our next speaker is Liz Foubister from Xodus Group Limited. She's got 20 years of experience in consenting projects in the marine environment, and she did the Maygen Phase 1 tidal array, the DVL Tor Head tidal array in Northern Ireland, and the Minesto Holyhead Deep tidal array. So you can imagine she often advises companies about EIA and so on for their marine projects. So Liz is going to talk about proportionate EIA, which I'm delighted about.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. Some interesting points there raised by Glen, which I can now hopefully give a bit more of a practical perspective to. You won't have a project generally of the size I'm going to be talking about today unless you have done an environmental impact assessment. So I'm just going to take us through a little bit about tidal EIA experience in the UK. Look at a couple of case studies of the Maygen and the Tor Head project to look at how we are being able to refine our approaches to EIA, in particular with regard to impacts on marine wildlife and collision risk, which I think is one of the biggest things for the tidal industry. And then I'll come to a close illustrating the importance of the monitoring of the early arrays. So here's a map here, just to help set the overall context. I think the map shows the key tidal project arrays in the UK. There's not every single array here, but of the 14 projects that are shown, 6 have received consent, 4 are currently going through determination, and a further 4 have got their EIAs ongoing. So I think, this slide clearly demonstrates that the UK is establishing a lot of experience in EIA for tidal arrays, and Xodus is lucky enough to have been involved with them, about 50% of these in some shape or form, whether it be overall EIA coordinator or providing just specialist input. So I think, the first EIAs that were done for tidal arrays were back in 2010 for the EMEC tidal test site and the then Scottish Power Renewable Sound of Islay project. And I think it's fair to say in the 6 years that have passed since then, there's been considerable investment in the marine energy industry. There's been a range of research studies into the investigation of potential impacts, and also there's been environmental monitoring of prototypes. For example, the MCT one that Glen's already mentioned, where we know there was a lot of investment there, and also in EMEC in Orkney, as well as other locations. I think, this increase in knowledge base has helped inform the understanding of the key environmental issues, and it is helping to shape the regulators and their advisors on their views on the requirement for specific environmental impact assessments. However, we do at present still have a lack of operational monitoring, and the protected status of certain marine species has meant that, to some extent, impacts assessments have had to be precautionary up to now. And I think this is particularly true of the impacts for which we've got no previous experience, including collision risk to birds, fish, and mammals. However, despite this lack of operational monitoring experience that we've got, I think particularly for arrays, it's fair to say we are already seeing some evidence of streamlining of EIA practices. We are seeing refined baseline survey scopes, that they're trying to provide meaningful data to the EIAs. And I think we're also more confidently being able to scope out impacts that are consistently being demonstrated to be not significant. So overall, my personal feeling is that EIAs are beginning to become appropriate to the scale of the projects and the potential impacts that there could be. And I think as our knowledge increases, we're seeing that same natural progression towards what can be classed as proportionate, but yet still needs to be robust and fit for purpose EIAs. And this is a similar trend to what was historically observed in other offshore industries, such as oil and gas and aquaculture, where we've now got very well established baseline characterization requirements and impact assessment methodologies. And the EIAs really do focus on what the key issues are and not study everything to the nth degree. So I'm just going to take you through the marine wildlife impact assessment for 2 projects, 2 different tidal array projects, and just demonstrate how I think lessons learned on the first one really managed to contribute to refining the assessments for the second project. So the 2 projects are Maygen, which a lot of you will be very familiar with, located off the north coast of Scotland in the Pentland Firth. This is phase 1 of it, 86 megawatt project, which is the size that the EIA established for their first application, and located about 2 kilometres offshore. Then I'm also going to speak about the Tor Head project. That's off the north coast of Northern Ireland. Again, this was a 100 megawatt project for which the application was submitted, located about 3 kilometres from shore. So quite similar scale projects. The Maygen one was the first EIA that had been done for what could really be classed as a significant scale project. A lot of the previous tidal EIAs, for example, EMEC and Sound of Islay, had been for much smaller arrays, generally about 10 megawatts. And they relied quite heavily on the Scottish Government deploy and monitor policy. So this meant that operational monitoring would be used to confirm the impact predictions that had been made in the environmental statement. And generally, because of the relatively small scale of these projects, it wasn't unreasonable to predict that impacts wouldn't be significant, and that the projects wouldn't be breaching some of the nature conservation legislation that Glen has been speaking about. But I think it's fair to say for Maygen, this wasn't an option at all. The EIA had to make an attempt to quantify all the potential impacts. It wasn't really possible to say that if you were going to put over 60 tidal turbines in an area that you weren't going to have a significant impact on the marine mammals or the birds or the fish. So, in order to allow the Scottish Government to make an informed decision on whether they could consent that project, which at the time was one of the world's largest tidal arrays, we had to look to quantify those different impacts. The Tor Head EIA, however, was undertaken a number of years after the Maygen application, and although the tidal industry hadn't quite got as far as establishing recognised approaches to marine wildlife impact assessment, as I'll demonstrate, it still was possible to capitalise on some of the lessons learned and the emerging research. So I think the biggest refinement in the approach to the EIA between the two projects was in relation to collision risk for birds and fish. As already said, there was extensive work undertaken for the Maygen project in order to quantify these risks. For birds, there was a 2-year baseline characterization survey, which I think that requirement was heavily influenced by what had gone before in the offshore wind industry. And this was followed by collision risk and population effect modelling. So the 2 years of survey data demonstrated that despite being located in an internationally important area for seabirds, there actually weren't significant numbers of birds in the offshore tidal area. And the modelling results indicated that birds would need to be colliding with and being killed by the turbines much more regularly than was feasible based on the number of birds that were actually on the site. So I think the EIA clearly demonstrated that there were potentially negligible impacts on birds. With regards to fish, there was no site-specific data, but because of the importance of the Pentland Firth as a migratory fish route, there was an extensive and precautionary modelling exercise undertaken to quantify the collision risk. And I think because the Pentland Firth was quite an important area, I think at the time this was necessary and appropriate. However, the very precautionary approach indicated that, again, extremely insignificant numbers of fish were likely to collide with the turbines, despite there being a number of unknowns for which precautionary and conservative assumptions had to be made. And there was quite a lot of subsequent work undertaken by the Scottish Government, and they confirmed that the findings of our assessment were broadly acceptable. So I think based on these lessons learned and the results from Maygen, it was possible to significantly refine the methodologies for the Tor Head project, while still being able to demonstrate that impacts were negligible and likely to be insignificant. So with regard to the birds, the first 12 months of site-specific survey data collected for the Tor Head project allowed very good site characterization. And again, it indicated that there were very low numbers of birds present, in particular an absence of or extremely low abundances of species that would dive down to the depths that the turbines would be at. And therefore, it was felt after 1 year of data that no further data on birds at the site was needed to be able to help conclude where we were for the impact assessment. And neither was it considered that collision risk modelling or population effect modelling would add any value to the EIA. So I think that was a real step forward. Obviously, site-specific issues, as we all know, will always be an important factor in determining the scope of an EIA, but both survey work for birds and the precautionary impact prediction that we appear to be showing that birds and fish collision risk is maybe not as big an issue as maybe was originally thought. It was a similar story for marine mammals. Collision risk is obviously, with mammals, is currently one of the key issues for the tidal energy industry. So I think here the main focus was really in how could we best predict what the impacts would be and what site-specific data is needed to inform the assessment. You know, we weren't looking at significantly reducing survey scopes or assessment methodologies. It was more about how can we best predict the impacts for this key issue. One of the key issues is whether site-specific data is able to generate statistically robust density estimates of marine mammals. And for the Maygen project, the site-specific surveys didn't allow for this. And interestingly, when we actually got to the modelling phase of trying to predict the collision risk with marine mammals, after a lot of consultation with the regulator and their advisors, we actually ended up resorting back to published data sources, and they were felt to be most appropriate to inform the impact assessment. So I guess this did somewhat question the value of the 2 years site-specific data that had been originally requested. At the time of the Maygen EIA, there wasn't an established model for determining collision risk with marine mammals, so we had to make use of a proprietary model that had been used to previously inform work for the Scottish Government on strategic impact assessment. This was the best that was available at the time, but it wasn't easily replicated by those who were determining the application. So actually they had to go away and do their own modelling in order to understand whether they felt what we had predicted was realistic or not. So I think, you know, that was an important lesson learned, that with regards to the Tor Head project, there was a lot more that we did with existing data for the site. There was further analysis that we could do of existing data, but this was also supplemented by site characterization surveys, which did allow us to generate a site-specific density for the key species here, which was harbour porpoise. But this was possible in less than 2 years of data. So I think, you know, we managed to demonstrate that it's not necessarily one solution that fits all for the surveys, and I think that's something that regulators and their advisors are now beginning to appreciate more. So I think in terms of, you know, what's the current status now and where do we need to get to? I think the case studies demonstrate that there is some progress being made. And I think with regards to baseline characterization for marine wildlife, I think there's a common understanding that methods employed to date to characterize sites aren't necessarily always have been fit for purpose. And I think there probably is still some way to go to agree what is appropriate and what data is required to inform the EIA, but there's a real realization of that now, which I think is positive. And we also always need to bear in mind that there will be site-specific issues that will influence the data that's required, and it won't be one solution fits all, as I've already said. With regards to the assessment of collision risk, I think we're beginning to see a standardization in assessment methods, and there are regulator-accepted tools now to help us more easily predict the impacts. But I think it's important that we don't set unnecessary precedents, in particular where we're routinely demonstrating insignificant impacts. I think one area where I don't think we should be modelling fish collision risk or bird collision risk for every project. And I think it's really important that assessment methodologies are quickly adapted in response to new findings as new projects go through the determination period and new research is published. I think we also need to strive for a consistent approach to consent conditions as well. I think so far in the UK, in the different jurisdictions, we have got slightly differing approaches. Some of the smaller demonstration arrays generally have extensive monitoring requirements, but then some have also included shutdown clauses if marine mammals are detected in the vicinity of the turbines. You know, but that hasn't been everywhere, and I think they're the types of clauses that we need to be starting to remove from consents where we feel comfortable to do that. For some of the larger arrays, obviously the Maygen project, that has a restricted consent until expansion is proved to be acceptable. And yet in other jurisdictions, projects are just being requested to have adaptive management plans and aren't so restrictive consents. So I think that's something that definitely still probably needs a little bit of work.
Can you wind up, please, Liz?
Yep, I'm on my last slide now. So I guess how do we continue to strive towards standardization of approach and proportionate EIA? I think we've got to continue to focus on improving our understanding of the key impacts, and I think the monitoring of initial arrays will be really important in this regard. Obviously the regulators, their advisors, and as well as developers all need to continue to work together towards a consensus on how we can best monitor marine wildlife, focusing on suitable and practicable approaches. And I guess the increase of our knowledge will be through a mix of research initiatives. I think we're already seeing that there's government-funded initiatives, for example, the UK ORGIP and the US-led Annex 4, but also developers are beginning to implement their own environmental monitoring based on results of EIAs. For example, Maygen, when they install their turbines this summer, and also Open Hydro in Canada. The importance of streamlining approaches can't be underestimated. I think to make the best progress in the shortest time scale, we really do need to ensure that we don't duplicate effort, that we look for ways to collaborate between the different jurisdictions, and that we really look to expedite application of results. You know, so we've got to ensure that lessons learned are being reflected in the impact assessment methodologies, and that these are being implemented in all jurisdictions. So I think overall, tidal EIAs are gradually being refined, maybe not as quickly as some of the developers would like to hope, but I feel we are making progress. And I think, you know, our ultimate aim is to get to where we have been with other offshore industries as common practice, just focusing on what the key issues are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. Yes, it's quite reassuring to hear that there is some progress being made on the EIA front, and I think this idea of actually learning from what's happened before is really important, because it's a waste of time and effort otherwise, isn't it, and money. Right, our final speaker this afternoon is Stuart Baird, who is Operations Director at EMEC. He was in the Navy, and he continues to operate very efficiently, as no doubt learned to in the Navy. He says here that he's overseen more than 1,000 marine energy activities. And I think that's the important thing about EMEC, is that they know more about this industry than any other organisation in the world. And I hope, he says he's going to talk about monitoring, which I think is another key issue, because if a developer has to have some sort of monitoring in place for wildlife, for example, for a marine mammal, and that monitoring equipment goes wrong, then the developer has to turn off the device. So for something which has actually got nothing to do with the operation of his device, it actually holds up the progress of the sector. So I'm hoping that Stuart can offer us a little help and advice on those sorts of issues. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, Steph. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm going to take about the next 10-15 minutes to just take you through a few slides talking about monitoring, and particularly more around the environmental monitoring, focused on what we do in the water as a result of Marine Scotland's deploy and monitor process that we operate at EMEC. Monitoring on the site varies from various different parts. We have our main substation, where we monitor the electrical output from the developers' devices, which are dangling off the ends of our cables, as you can see on the screen. We also have a number of MET stations, so we're looking at the MET data, and we're feeding all this information out through to the developers as well and sharing the information. We have a marine radar, primarily used at the moment to give us some MET data. We're looking at the wave information through the radar using the WAMOS system, but also we can use it as an additional recording medium for vessel activity on the site, should it be required. But primary focus on that is the wave resource, because it's something that's of relevance to the developers looking at operating their devices on site. And we have done a lot of ADCP surveys which are backed up with a model, a two-dimensional model we have for the site. So we corroborate that actual, those operations and the model itself to give us an idea of the resource. Wildlife monitoring. We've been carrying that out for a number of years now, over 8 years, based upon a grid upon the tidal site here, and the wildlife observer sitting up on the hillside on the island, reporting back what's seen of various different activities depending on what's required over a period of time. We also carry out acoustic surveys to look at the acoustic baseline. How noisy is the water before we put anything in? How noisy is it once we're operating something? And we've also done additional monitoring through our integrated monitoring platform, a pod which sits on the seabed. More about that to come in shortly. And we also record all our AIS, automatic identification system, for vessel traffic going through the site, so as we can see what's happening. And we've got with playing it back through or loading up through a database, we're able to play back any incidents or any activities on site and see who was out there in which spot at what time. Just gives us an element of control, an element of history that's there that we can go back and compare should we have to look at something in further detail. So the integrated marine energy monitoring platform, which is the system we operate within EMEC, is built up of all these different activities. There are additional activities which weren't mentioned earlier on within the monitoring, primarily around things like looking at biofouling and systems like that. So we have additional monitors we place out, additional test platforms we place out to look at the biofouling effects on various different materials on the site. We look at doing different surveys with ROVs, etc., as well, to see the state of devices, cables, and the seabed around and about the devices themselves. Data management is an important area. We have our own SCADA system, which provides us with primarily engineering data, of interest to me, engineer. But we also use the engineering data, and we feed that through into a main database, which we've also, over the last 2 years, put in all our various different information systems from our resource monitors and from our wildlife observations. So we're tying everything together using one timestamp, so we can see what was happening at what time on what day regarding the resource, the devices that were there, and the operations that were being carried out. Just more information, and we're providing that as a service and support to the developers who are on site. The monitoring platform, the main part that we operate, is the pod itself. The monitoring pod is a seabed unit. It's a hardwired seabed unit, providing us with a platform which gives us live data back from an active sonar, ADCP, conductivity, temperature, density profiler, hydrophones, giving us passive acoustic data, and various other sensors can be fitted as and when required. Platform's been deployed on a number of occasions now over the last few years. First off, in its first guise, was under the ETI project, and we've worked on that since with the Carbon Trust through the MRCF project over the last 2 years. Pod itself is a 2 by 2 meter cube, weighs about 8.5 tons, but it's a flexible platform. It enables us to fit at relatively short notice different sensors as required. We can recover this platform to deck, we can fit new sensors and redeploy over a tide. That's the plan, and it does work. The pod deployment, simple, as I say, done over a tide. 2 photographs you've got here. The left-hand picture is the start of the day, glorious midsummer's day when we eventually got to put the pod out into the water. The picture on the right-hand side is later on that day when we had a 2 meter swell with a 30-knot wind blowing across the deck, and it was bitterly cold, and it was horrible. So the weather does change quite quickly, and it takes a lot of planning to get this right. The pod itself sits on the seabed on a concrete frame. The idea of that is it gives us a repeatable position that we can go back into, and we have a target for the active sonar to look at. Systems that work off the pod itself include the ADCP, the current profiler, which gives us the standard resource, the currents that are going through, and also some idea of the waves down at the bottom end of the site. This is located towards the south of the EMEC tidal site. We also feed that information through onto SCADA in a slightly different way. So we're interpreting the data and providing a link into a different system to enable the developers to read what's happening, to get a live feed from the ADCP through their own systems. And then we do background analysis on the ADCP data as well and provide that out. CTD, again, the same thing. We're bringing the data in, we're converting it into usable systems that we can then, or processes that we can then load onto the SQL database. So we do a lot of scripting and a lot of work in the background and QCing of the data before we put it into our database. One of the main constituent parts of the pod is the active sonar. The sonar we're using at the moment is from the company Ultra Electronic Systems, that are primarily a UK defence sonar company. And this sonar has been operating out on site when the pod's been out for a number of years. I was mentioning earlier on about the repeatability of the positioning and to be able to look at the target. The top picture was our first attempt to deploy the pod. We got the angle slightly off on the frame itself. The second, the lower picture is the actual target, which is the Alstom tripod at the time. No turbine fitted at the time when this was out, unfortunately. But it gave us a target that was fixed that we could look at, and we could tune the sonar to make sure we were happy with its results, because we're looking across the tide, so we're seeing a lot of turbulence in the water, so we can make sure we can see targets, which it works very well. I also mentioned earlier on about acoustic data. Now, acoustic data, raw acoustic data takes megabytes. It is absolutely bucket loads of this stuff. So there's a lot of processing that goes on in the background. And when you go through your processing, you get some interesting results. These, you may not be able to see them on the two blue screens, on the blue pictures on the left-hand side, but you'll see a discernible large spike on the top right-hand graph there. That's a seal scarer operating at about 6 kilohertz on a fish farm some 6+ miles away from the site. So it's a discernible loud noise that's there to scare seals away from a fish farm that we can hear on the tidal site. And we're supposed to be monitoring our site to make sure we're not making too much noise to disturb the local seals. We also have the radar system. As I mentioned earlier on, we have it based around WAMOS. We're also working through the Flowbeck project with Paul Bell at the National Oceanographic Centre, and he's been doing a lot of work, and these are some of the images that are produced as a result of analysing the data in the background. The top two pictures show the deployment of the Scott Renewables SR250 turbine a number of years ago. The right-hand one showing the vessel leaving, having deployed the device. And the bottom two just give you an idea of the variability of the wave resource on the site itself as a result of the different directions of the wind coming at us. Additional wildlife monitoring. I took the opportunity during the refurbishment to fit some cameras onto the pod and put them out on the seabed. I'd like to thank any piece of kelp that's gone past in keeping the camera clean for the period that the device was deployed, because it gave some great photographs of fish using the frame as a nice little home. And the right-hand side, we've got the best creel pot in the country. This is our haul at the last time we recovered this out on site. It's a good number of crabs there. One of the main issues we have around any monitoring system, and we've mentioned earlier on about the costs associated with monitoring and the breakdowns of monitoring devices, is experience and building up that experience. And I'd like to share a few photographs of some of the issues we've had around corrosion. Nasty, horrible stuff. Stainless steel, designed to work in the sea. Wonderful stuff. It rusts, it leaks, it makes things go bang, and you lose your system. Left-hand picture, shackled stainless steel with a stainless steel pin. It's rusted away. Thankfully, we recovered this system before it got too bad. The right-hand photograph, you can see a thread. You may be able to see a small blue collar on that thread. That blue collar is what's left of a nylock nut after about 12 months deployed at sea. The stainless steel nylock nut has been eaten away. These are the sort of things we've got to think about and how we can get around these issues and actually get things working better. Choice of materials. Make sure you choose the right things. These are all examples of fully suitable specified materials for use at sea under the water. The bottom right-hand picture shows the connectors that are on the device as a result of 3 months deployment being lifted, and those photographs were taken within a matter of a few hours as the pod started to dry out. So corrosion is still a big issue. There's still a lot we don't know out there about the sites and how to monitor them, but we are learning, and the more we work together, the more likely we are to get this right sooner. Just leave you with a set of numbers. There's lots of numbers here, as you'd expect. Some of the data we've collected, we've got over 14 terabytes of data. And I'd like to invite people within the audience here, if they have any good ideas of what we could do with that data, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. What are you going to do with those terabytes of data? Right, well, that was a very varied session, I think, and so lots of topics that you might wish to ask our speakers. We've got 10 minutes to have a Q&A session. There should be some microphones around. Could you put your hand up if you've got anything to ask, please? Yes, because...
Hello, everybody on the panel. I'm Bill Mowat. I'm from Gills Harbour on the Pentland Firth shore. I'm also a member of the local community council, which is the lowest element of consultation. The first thing I'd say to the last speaker from EMEC, has he spoken to the R&D department at the Subsea 7 yard at Wester? Because they're the people that know the specifications of different varieties of stainless steel as resistant to the sea on one side and sometimes acidic H2S, oil and gas on the other.
To answer that point, yes, we have specifically talked to various different developers within the oil and gas sector. We've tried to make inroads into that area, and interestingly, there's far more interest in working with marine renewables as a result of the turn down in the oil and gas sector just now. But yes, we have done that. The problem we're finding is that a lot of the materials that are used are designed for 600, 1,000 meter water depth. There's no oxygen down there. Where we are working is 30 to 50 meters, so there's a heck of a lot more oxygen in that water, and that's part of the problem. So the systems are suffering as a result of that primarily. So it's, as I say, we've still got a lot to learn, and we're working with a lot of different developers and manufacturers on these points.
Of course, there will be the question of extra oxidizing. Whenever the sea is being stirred up, it's being oxidized, isn't it? So there will be possible questions there. But anyway, I thought I'd just pose that one because there are so many different grades of stainless. You know, members of the public think about stainless and generic. And it's not always advantageous, as we know at Gills Harbour, where we've got a set of key ladders made from stainless, which is not entirely satisfactory. Anyway, the other thing I would say, I would ask, and I want to think the panel's opinion on it, is why does it not seem to be the case that socioeconomic reward for the littoral community isn't at the very top of the requirements for the EIA? This was the thing that concerned us very greatly on amongst the local people living next to the Maygen site when it was...
That's a very good question. Well, thank you. Liz, would you like to start?
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. I don't think it's that the reward isn't top of the list for the local community. I think there has been a lot of consultation with the local community for all the projects I've been involved with. I think the legislation we're dealing with is all about ecological issues, and I guess it's the legislation that needs to be passed to get a project consented. impacts on other sea users are part of that, part of that assessment. But I think a lot of as Glen has explained, there's litigation issues with nature conservation legislation and things. So that tends to be maybe where some of the impacts are lesser known and there's more effort. But these EIAs do also recognise impacts on other sea users, and just have to try and give the balanced approach. I guess community benefit is a different issue, separate to project consent, and it is, that's the project developers. There have been different precedents set in different industries. But at the moment, we're not dealing with projects that are going to be generating a lot of income that actually, allows there to be a lot of benefit. It's all about getting the industry established at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I think Joe wants to say something.
Yeah, Bill, you mentioned socio-economic reward. I think that's a really important point, both at a local level, but also at a national level. And I think this is often overlooked. Yeah, and so I appreciate the question. I think it's often overlooked at national level, which of course aggregates many minor projects that are local to the community. In the economic case for energy, the energy economics often focuses on the cost to the consumer. The UK government focuses on the cost to the consumer, and I would like to see more focus on the potential for wealth creation, job creation, and the socio-economics that can flow from different energy projects being supported by the government.
That's a very good point, Joe, thanks. I think Ronnie wants to say, has a comment to make.
Just to chime in with a couple of the other comments there. I think there is a case for balancing the socio-economic reward and the impact on the environment, and I think that can be used in a number of ways. However, as in the limbo that we're in just now with no actual elected ministers, but the former energy minister, Fergus Ewing, said, first, to make your rabbit stew, catch your rabbit. And we're still at the stage of making this sector economically viable in itself, and there's still a huge element of that to go.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Do any of the other panel want to make a comment?
Sorry, I'd like to ask one question of Lisa. Lisa, is the High report public now? Okay. There's a report that's due out fairly soon that looks at the economic impact as a result, or benefit as a result of EMEC being in existence, and there's some significant figures in that which are looking at it as all the way through to a national level.
Right. Oh, I've seen the presentation by Aquaterra, is it? Showing all the inward investment through the marine industry. What about you, Glen? Have you got a comment?
I suppose I could add, you shouldn't simply look at substantive law and policy, you should look at procedural law and policy as well. And there's a very useful convention called the Aarhus Convention, which is all about EIA, rights to environmental information and public participation. And that convention, although it's an international convention, it's not part of EU law, has to be given very high regard in the application of EU law and therefore national law. So, people should be using that. And indeed, there's one Scottish lady who used it in opposing a very large onshore wind farm in Argyll, I believe it was, very effectively. So you don't necessarily need to go to court. There's you can make a complaint to the Aarhus Compliance Committee. I know some of the people on it. They're extremely good. They're unpaid, and it doesn't cost anything to as it were, assert your rights by writing to them.
Thank you. I think it's time to actually close this session now. I see our man in charge of the door is about to open it. So thank you all for attending. I think, you know, given the wide range of topics we've heard, it's been quite a fascinating session for me. And please, would you thank the speakers in the normal way?